I'm from the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and Alexandra's asked me to just say a few words to welcome you this afternoon to the inaugural event of the new Security Studies Network, sponsored by the University of Ottawa and, of course, our good friends at the Centre for International Policy Studies. This network is designed more than anything to facilitate interaction and engagement between the wide variety of individuals across faculties and across departments within the University of Ottawa and more broadly, who are interested in security studies broadly defined. Our vision for it is that it is, in terms that I think our speaker today would hopefully approve of, rigorously eclectic in its approach to both topic and analysis. It welcomes everything from pure theory to policy-specific work. It welcomes those who are engaged in issues of domestic security, to issues of international security and the interactions and interfaces between them. It is designed more than anything to provide a forum and a focal point that we hope will engage people in the incredibly dynamic series of issues that now surround international security. Without further ado then, we will pass a list around. Anyone who would like to be on the email list for further events, please just let us know. And we very much hope to both engage with you and to welcome you to further events for the Security Studies Network. And indeed, it comes hard on the heels of the successful launch just last week of the International Relations Theory Network, which also had an extremely successful first event last week. So thank you all for coming. Without further ado, I'll turn you over to Alexandra and then to the person who you're really here to see.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you in particular to our guest, Professor Peter Katzenstein, who doesn't really need an introduction, but he's going to get one anyway, albeit a brief one. Professor Katzenstein is the Walter Carpenter Professor of International Studies in the Government Department at Cornell University in the US. He recently served as the president of the American Political Science Association, and he has received more research and teaching prizes than I could possibly mention here. Let me just say that as an expert in comparative politics and international relations, a historian and one of the very few in our field who have effectively bridged the quantitative and qualitative divide, he has made an extraordinary contribution to international relations, to political science more broadly. He has crossed multiple disciplinary boundaries and has consistently invited us to think about old issues and problems in new ways. Professor Katzenstein is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of more than 30 books, if you can imagine, and over 100 articles and book chapters on a wide range of issues of political economy, security, and culture in world politics. Some of his recent books include Beyond Paradigms, Analytic Eclecticism in World Politics, with Rudra Seal, Civilizations in World Politics, Plural and Pluralist Perspectives, European Identity, co-edited with Jeffrey Checkle, Rethinking Japanese Security, Anti-Americanism in World Politics, co-edited with Robert Cohen, and Religion in an Expanding Europe with Tim Burns. And this is just a few on a very, very rich CV. As if that wasn't sufficiently impressive, since joining the Cornell Department of Government in 1973, Professor Katzenstein has chaired or co-chaired more than 100 dissertation committees. And I'm very happy and proud to be able to say that I was part of that group, also known as the Cornell Mafia, wherever you go in the world. I have learned a great deal from my teacher over the years, but I still could not, for the life of me, explain to you how he manages to do it all, and to do it so successfully. A few years ago, he turned his attention to the concept of civilization, and impressively, he produced not just a book, not a couple of articles, but 3 books on civilizations in world politics. And we are delighted that he has agreed to come and talk to us about his project on civilizations. Thank you so much to all, and please join me in welcoming our guest, Professor Peter Katzenstein.
So this is a challenge here, because Cynthia gave me a thing to hold and click, which taxes my intelligence beyond belief. So. Well, you serve a mean lunch here, that much I must say. Whatever the network is, it's a very good lunch. So, and the purpose for the visit actually was not to give a lecture, but to go skating. And on this, I must say, the visit has been a bust, because I was supposed to go skating yesterday, and this morning, Alexander said, no skating today. But this morning, she walks me over that canal, you know, and the ice is perfect. And I'm schlepping around these skates to Toronto and McGill. I'll be back, Alexander, but I'm going to get that skate done. So thank you very much for the invitation. Alexander and Shredyan were actually part of the project, so there's a reason to talk here. I learned enormously from both of them. If you think about civilization, the clash of civilizations, you cannot miss the eastern border of Estonia, Maria, which is where the clash of civilization is, of course, instantiated. This I just learned it. 7 minutes to 12, so I just wanted to be sure, Maria, to acknowledge you and that clash. But you'll be disappointed, the project is actually beyond Estonia or the clash. It's beyond East and West. So why the project? Largely because the freshmen in my intro course over the last 20 years always vote on the best article, the one they find most compelling. And the top 3 each year is Huntington's article from 1993, okay? And of course, the professoriate, sophisticated and left-leaning, hates the vote, but democracy speaks with a clear voice on this issue. And I, by now, give a lecture in the course. It has had 0 effect on my freshmen in the past fall. 0 effect, okay? They said, makes no sense whatsoever. So that's one reason. But the other reason is, in fact, that the category of East and West is so much part of our common language and of the mental maps with which we all operate, that all my professoriate friends in cultural studies who hate the term civilization, which has all its connotations of the 19th century and the hierarchical thought, you know, and you're saying, yeah, the arguments, okay, we can, but the term, get rid of the term. And I've offered them a wager at every lecture over the last 4 years when I talk on the subject and say, well, I'll make you a bet. You give me the money which you want to put on the table. If you're not a millionaire, I'll put the same amount on the table. You give me your research specialty, okay? And I'll give you my category of East and West. And we'll do a content analysis of the leading newspapers around the world. Right? And we'll see who comes in first. And nobody's taking up the bet because they understand that this is, in fact, this cognitive orientation. I have it, you have it, it's the way we think. And so the project is actually, you know, designed to think about these categories. And it very much started off, Cynthia, this is my first click. Let's see whether this works. Brilliant. When Huntington, now, who was not my teacher, but whom I respect deeply as a scholar, although I disagree with his politics, when he published this article, you know, and it was, of course, an article which was a test balloon. He had tested the coming war with Japan, that didn't fly, and the coming war with China, and that didn't fly. And then came the clash of civilizations, and that balloon was picked up by the currents. You know, he was very political in trying out ideas after 1989. So it got under my skin right away, and I did a book in 1996 on national security, and there, lo and behold, in the conclusion, you know, I write about hunting, just a few pages, but it was right there in my head. Okay? So I had a deep engagement with this, although I didn't know how to think about it. So his view, Huntington's view, is not very different from President Hu Jintao's view. Here's something which the president said recently. We must clearly see that international hostile forces are intensifying the strategic plot of westernizing and dividing China. and ideological and cultural fields are the focal areas of their long-term infiltration. Okay? We should deeply understand the seriousness and complexity of the ideological struggle, always sound the alarms and remain vigilant, and take forceful measures to be on guard and respond. This is from the president who talks about harmony in the world. Okay? So it's not just Huntington. In China, in fact, this civilizational discourse is much more important than in the United States, Europe, India, or Japan. Okay? When the Chinese heard that I was doing these books, they signed up for translation rights right away. The first volume is already translated. They want to translate the other two. They will do it within a year. Okay? There's a big market for this. And I experienced this myself. I was interviewed last year on CTV9, which is sort of the Charlie Rose of China, right? English language, but very erudite, sophisticated host. Within first 15 minutes, he stopped the interview and said, "Would you like to apologize to the Chinese audience now?" And I said, "Wait a minute. This I hadn't heard. I thought I was a professor, and we were debating how to think about civilization." He found the talk so disagreeable that he didn't finish the interview. Of course, it didn't get broadcast, right? So Samuel Huntington is alive and well, okay? Beta University, where I teach a lot, all essentialists, all of them, every last one of them, among the students. Students are brilliant, okay? But they are smart, so when they hear it, they say, more, I want to think about this, okay? So what's the position? Well, for Huntington and President Hu, civilizations are combative and they are clashing. They're not plural or pluralist. They are defined by core values, not by multiple traditions. So that is the core of the talk. I will argue that civilizations exist in the plural, I think this is right, and that they're internally pluralist. They don't exist organized around core values which cohere, but around multiple traditions which contest and are conflicted. The argument I'm making is different from Huntington's cultural realism, which has the story half right. Huntington insists properly, in my opinion, that there are plural civilizations. It's not just the West. He actually distinguishes China, the West, and Islam. Okay? There might be other ones. He said, I don't know what to do about Africa. Well, Africa is complicated because there are probably 24 civilizations. Okay? Political science isn't very tuned to this, but historians are. So cultural pluralism says plural civilizations. I think this is right. Cosmopolitan liberals, most of my friends and colleagues, have no trouble understanding that the civilizations internally are pluralist. They're divided. There's contestation going on. But they resist the notion that it's a world of plural civilizations. Because in the end, a liberal, when you scratch the liberal, says, it's a world of liberal values. We will prevail. Just give us time. Okay? They've had 200 years. They speak English with a loud voice. And I think it's just a matter of time of repeating the same message. I think this is a big, big mistake. Okay? So I will argue that it's a plural world and the civilizations are pluralist. Now, in order to underline the importance, jokes are always good, particularly for the beginning of lectures. I think that the deeper insight I got from what is a burgeoning industry on the web of Jewish-Buddhist jokes. So I'll tell you 3, okay? Drink tea and nourish life. With the first sip, joy. With the second sip, satisfaction. With the third sip, peace. With the fourth, a Danish. Okay? The Tao does not speak. The Tao does not blame. The Tao does not take sides. The Tao has no expectations. The Tao demands nothing of others. The Tao is not Jewish. Okay? The Torah says, love your neighbor as yourself. The Buddha says, there is no self. So maybe we're off the hook. Okay? I think these jokes actually illustrate what I would call the hyphenation, the spanning of civilizations, the bridging efforts, of which, of course, the School of Public Policy here is only one example. So here's what I'm going to do. You are the lucky recipients of the second audience of this lecture. Toronto was exposed to the full Fidel Castro version, which I will spare you, okay? We will stop at 10 of 1. This is my promise. I will skip what isn't. I will talk basically around these 3 books. And the first part of the talk is on the first book, which is the conceptual apparatus. And the second part is on the third part of the book, which is third book, you know, on Anglo-America. I will skip the volume on China. You only get to see the cover, okay? So, and I will talk a bit at the end about an idea which is in the last chapter of the third volume, which is sort of where my head is now and where I want to get clearer in my head, which is what I call polymorphic globalism, which I admit is a really uniquely ugly concept. So here is Kandinsky in the wrong colors. The electronic transmission of these colors has made haywire out of Kandinsky for all 3 volumes. This is Kandinsky in 1924 to 1926, what's called his circle phase. And for once, I actually spent effort and time to get covers for the books. They're all from the same 3 years. Kandinsky is a wonderful painter, but the colors are not the real colors. I wanted the visual image of this intersectionality overlapping, which is my image of the world. I would explain this to my freshmen, you know, think about how do you think about the world before and after the Cold War? I say, think of the telephone pad. Left-hand bottom on the bottom, straight lines, right? North, south, east, west. Right-hand button, an asterisk, okay? What happened in 1989? The left-hand button became irrelevant. The right-hand button became relevant, right? That was in the context of that the right-hand button, an asterisk, organized around the American empire, right? On civilizations, this is, for me, the right image. So, civilizations, when we think about world politics, we normally use 2 terms interchangeably, which is a big mistake, globalization and internationalization. When I was in graduate school, that was 1,000 years ago, it was international interdependence. Okay? So the concept changes, but the idea behind it is sort of the same, except that globalization is in fact a term used by sociologists and anthropologists and talks largely about the reconfiguration of state sovereignty. And it talks about the constitutive norms and processes which create local and local combinations. Toyota was sort of the metaphor for this, the Toyota production system, right? Internationalization is a more conventional idea from its Latin root, internationes, between nations. And it talks about increasing density of exchanges. More trade, more people, more ideas, crossing borders between existing units. This is how economists and political scientists typically think about the world. Civilizations, the talk about civilizations talks about contexts of meaning and contexts of practices. You know, a friend of mine, Takashi Shiraishi in Japan, says, listen, I fly to Taiwan. It sort of feels familiar. Architecture, food, time zone, whatever. When I fly to America, and he taught at Cornell for 20 years, you know, it sort of feels different. Arnold Wolfers used to call this the milieu goal, right? So here, with civilizations, we talk about contexts of greater or lesser senses of familiarity, which are not rooted in national identity necessarily. So one reason why I did this project is that when I wrote a book on regions, which Alexander didn't mention, but which I think is a pretty good book, it had one lousy chapter in it. The chapter on regional identities. It's thin gruel, that chapter, compared to the rest of the book. And I wanted to understand why, and there's something to do with the fact that you're too much beholden with that concept to the notion of territoriality. Yes, there is European identity, you know, particularly European politicians and elites. They're all European. Everybody else, you know, goes to the soccer match and bashes the other side, right? So, this is in a way an attempt also to specify regional identities better. So if that was the theoretical motivation, what about the outcomes? Well, the outcome for Huntington was clash. And you ask yourself, where did he get the category? And I did not, I asked him that actually, but he never got to see the 3 books he died while they were being produced. You know, the clash is one of 24 outcomes in Toynbee. And I would say, well, Sam, what about the other 23? Why do we look at history only through one prism if Toynbee in fact says there are 24? So for me, the overarching outcome is inter-civilizational encounters. That includes violent clash, I'm not denying it, and cultural imperialism. But it also includes trans-civilizational engagement. I met one student here from ANU, you know, he studies Canadian-Australian foreign policy in Somalia and Afghanistan. Well, I think he is in the world of engagement, not of encounter. You know, they sort of are similar people, the Australians, the Canadians. They are part of Anglo-America, right? Now, in the civilizational outcome, the one which strikes me as the most prominent, the most frequent, is what I would call the shifting balances of practices, hybridization. Okay? That's not to deny the occurrence of clash or engagement, but most of the time, I think, it's actually hybridization. So what are civilizations? Well, historians tell us, you know, and I did read a little bit of Toynbee and Spengler, but not much. Okay? That did strike me as musty. I said there must be a better, more recent generation of scholars who have thought this through, and I will talk about them very briefly on the next slide. But it is true that civilization, almost everybody defines them in terms of urbanity. It is the city exploiting the peasants. This is uniform, okay? It's an elite phenomenon. It's rooted in language, literature, and religion. Those seem to be the key concepts when you talk about what is a civilization. One of the great historians of civilization, William McNeill, who was at the University of Chicago, writing this brilliant book, The Rise of the West, in 1990, looks back at his own work and writes a book review of his own book. If you want to read one piece in civilization analysis, that's the one piece I would recommend. Journal of Global History, Volume 1. Okay, forget about the 3 books. That essay. And he says, you know, it's a pretty good book, but I forgot one big thing, which I learned, he doesn't say that, but I inferred, from my colleague Marshall Hodgson, who was the grandfather of Islamic studies in the United States. Published 3 huge volumes in the 1970s, died prematurely. He said, I forgot about the context, the broader context in which the West is embedded. I took this to be really important. Now, why Sam Huntington didn't read this article and didn't think about it is beyond me, okay? Because he talks about civilizations as if they were actors. Civilizations are not actors, they are contexts. Actors are operating within civilizational contexts. And the civilization itself is embedded in a larger context. So for Huntington, a civilization is like a voice in your head, which tells you what to do. From my conceptualization, it's not a voice. It's a town hall meeting in which we argue about our choices. Big different conceptualization, because the voice drives you. There's only one voice. The town hall meeting maps the options. The options are not infinite, yeah? But they exist in pluralist form. So how do we think then about the categories of analysis? Huntington thinks about what I would call dispositional analysis. It's actor-oriented. It's consensual. The actors agree. It's essentialist, and it's unchanging. The actors, the West, is what it was and is, which means you reconstruct the West in a certain intellectual tradition. I can assure you, no Holocaust, okay, in Huntington's understanding of the West. As an ex-German, this strikes me as a rather peculiar view of the West, okay? Since no imperialism. Now, the imperialism for me is a Holocaust on a global scale. This is weird, okay? It's the Enlightenment. It's Rome, the Enlightenment, all the good things in life, right? It's like only the chocolate chips in the muffin, you know? So this is weird, okay? A second form of analysis is discursive. It looks at processes, at contestation, at relationships, and civilizations suddenly are infinitely malleable. Now, this is the position, for example, of a close colleague and friend of mine, Patrick Jackson, who wrote a brilliant book about civilization before the Cold War. So you have Jackson on the one hand and Huntington on the other. They sort of talk to each other. But they totally disagree because Patrick is totally in the discursive camp. I've argued with him for years. And his basic position is, we've talked with each other now for half an hour, so you and I will leave the room changed. And after every conversation, I say, Patrick, we've talked to each other for years, and you and I leave the room unchanged. So your position is incoherent, okay? So I'm not in the discursive camp, although the power of discourse, which redraws symbolic boundaries, is very important in understanding civilizations. I'm not denying it, but it's not all of it. And then finally comes the category of primordiality. That is the essentialist category of the West or the East or Islam or whatever, okay? Which is disposition and discourse rolled into one. It's a social construct. Now that's complicated language. Let's just reframe that. It's a political project. Huntington's book is a great book because he's utterly honest about his enterprise. He starts on the first page and he ends on the last page and he reminds the reader all along, I want to change the way you think about the world. I want to create a category, a set of categories, so that after the end of the Cold War, you can see the new world. Well, it turned out to be the old world, actually. Okay, there was nothing new about it. He recreated the categories, East and West, not the Soviet Union and the United States, but China and the United States, Islam and the United States. And it's a way of thinking which is deeply rooted in the 19th century. Marcus here someplace wrote a book on the political theory of this, the civilized and the uncivilized. And even I talked to a student who's studying European security practices. Even there today you find it on the ground. Okay, so it's a very old way of the world. Okay, now this creation, this political project exists not just in the creation of the category of the civilization. It exists in the field of gender studies, race, ethnicity, and sometimes nationality. When does this political project have the greatest chance of succeeding? Well, when smart intellectuals operate in situations of fear, threat, or uncertainty. That is when we are taken hostages by the category. And once you're taken hostage by the category, you've lost the game of seeing the world. So what about those theories? My God, Cynthia, nothing has happened here. This is disaster. Where are you, Cynthia? Yeah, now, but now I've broken your speaker. There were 6 slides. I pushed religiously and nothing happened. Okay, you're on the right page. Okay. Here are the 3 theorists from whom I'm borrowing. Okay, Shmuel Eisenstadt is macro-sociologist, Israeli, died last year at the ripe age of 89. He was as hungry at the age of 88 when I met him last as a first-year graduate student. Unbelievably impressive. Eisenstadt had made a big mistake in the 1960s. He had become a modernization theorist, and then he spent the next 50 years of his life trying to publish himself out of that incomprehensible position, and comes out with a very rich formulation of multiple modernities. We live in a civilization of modernity, but it manifests itself in multiple modernities because these civilizations, he calls them axial age civilizations, they come all of the same creation of the 6th century when these world religions were created. They are reactivated in situations of crisis and stress. So while the hamburger may look the same in Roppongi, in Beijing, and in Ottawa, it's not the same hamburger. Okay. Second person, Randall Collins, sociologist who is one of 2 people who sort of anticipated the end of the Cold War. Nobody in international relations did that, myself included. Okay. He writes a big book on schools of thought and philosophy. Okay. And the philosophers hate the book. It's not about philosophy. It's about zones of prestige and competition within these schools and between these schools. And he says the prestige is related to the contestation about ideas. People didn't want to study in Spain during the Middle Ages. That's where the Inquisition was. They wanted to be in Córdoba. That was the Islamic civilization at its height. That's where the action was. You wanted to study mathematics? Don't go to Oxford or Cambridge. Go to India. Okay? Long distance networks. If you were in Rome, you were interested in ideas, you get out of Rome as fast as you can. You go to Athens. That's where the action is. You're in Washington in the 1920s, get out of Washington, go to Paris. That's where the action is. Okay? That idea strikes me as very plausible for showing that competition is enormously important for civilizational vibrancy. And finally, Norbert Elias, a German historian, sociologist, who talked about the civilizing process. He talked about how did the European aristocracy acquire table manners, which was a long and complicated process. You know, in 1400, you could fornicate at the dinner table, you could stab the other person in the eye if you wanted that piece of meat. No manners. Well, by the time the 16th century rolls around, things have changed. And he has basically a psychological theory. Okay. Well, these restraints, of course, operate, and the processes of civilizational process don't operate just in domestic affairs. They operate also internationally. Cynthia, I'm going to push now. And it's going backwards. Now you push and I stop. Good. I'm just going to wave when we push, okay? I knew this wasn't going to work. So how do we do this? One simple idea. Don't use binary categories. That's what the project that I pressed on all the authors. You got to think about multiplicities of actors, domestically, internationally, of traditions, right? And of processes. So here comes volume 2 in inaccurate colors. It's brooding brown and yellow, but as Ringo said, you can't judge a book by looking at its covers. It's all about processes, okay? But it's about the rise of China. And having lectured on this in China, I'll tell you, it feels like you hit the drum and it reverberates in the Chinese audience. In a way this audience or no audience in Europe or no audience in the United States reverberates. It's an amazingly different experience lecturing on this topic. Doesn't reverberate in Japan, by the way. But in China, you're hitting something which just is there. Bella was lecturing at the Beijing Forum last year. Lou Pauly was there, you know, and there was a Nobel Prize winning economist from Chicago there. And he gives a speech to 1,000 people, you know, and dead silence. He says, you've got to have property rights, you've got a rule of law, and then you've got to come to Chicago and study economics, and then you'll be great. Okay? Didn't go over too well. Bella gives a talk on civil religions. And there are 1,000 people walking out of the lecture room together with Bella, and they want to talk more. Okay? So I just wanted to alert you to the fact it's not a hot topic in this part of the world. It's a very hot topic and not thought through for Hun Jintao and the Chinese. So here comes the third volume, Anglo-America. Now, of course, we're talking, this is Canada, right? And the motivation for me was to talk or think through about liberalism and race, and there Shodian's work has been enormously important to my clarification. So Anglo-America, I was taught by Louis Hortz. I believed in Louis Hortz. Okay, the liberal tradition in America, this was a great book, okay? It sort of fed like mother's milk to the IR discipline. They're all liberals, those who are liberals, right? And Louis Hortz was in fact very influential for shaping Huntington's view of the world. So Huntington writes out of American democracy in the 1970s, 1980s, and he has a Hortzian view of liberal America. Political citizenship, basically, with one dominant tradition. Huntington rewrites that book. It's the last book before he dies. Who are we, or who is us, or whatever, right? Which he adjusts, which he writes because he couldn't answer the one question which people gave him. He could answer all other questions, but the one he couldn't answer after the Clash and Civilization was, who are we? He said, you know what, that's a very good question. That's worth another 7 years of a book. Writes the book and reformulates his view on America. America is no longer defined by political citizenship, but by more thicker blood type. Okay, here is a Protestant, an Anglo-Protestant cultural creed, which everybody in America subscribes to. Jews, Catholics, Protestants, you know. Huntington is 8th generation, goes back to the 17th century. Well, you can imagine that the Catholics and the Jews writing the book review said, not so fast, okay? We've got some disagreements here. So the other view on American liberalism, closer to Canadian debates, we had a big debate in Toronto last year when we talked about drafts, you know, is Roger Smith and the view of America constituted by multiple traditions. And Smith says, yeah, liberalism is important, but what about republicanism? Not like the Republican Party, but republicanism as a political theory out of the 18th century. And what about racism? Race is constitutive of America. How can you write a book on liberal America and not talk about race? So the multiple traditional argument of America, of course, translates right away into civilizational analysis. We are stuck. There we are. So the project takes off from the insight that there are many Wests, not just one West. We're not just saying here's the West. Anglo-America is different from the Americas, and it's different from Europe. First idea, multiple actors, right? Second idea, very much influenced by among other things, Shodian, was that Anglo-America changes over time. In the 19th century, it was all about empire, liberalism, and race, and this hierarchical view of who was civilized and who was not. Right? Now, if you're an essentialist, you say, okay, that ought to be true for the next, from then on. It turns out that the belief structure about the West changes. So that after 1945, new sets of ideas come up, and in this project we then look at the communities of complex sovereignties, shared diplomatic cultures, and special relations. It seems like the West is like the Wizard of Oz. There's no there. You can in fact take the core out and reinstill it with other contested ideas. And that mattered a great deal to me and to the project. So yes, race remains constitutive of liberalism, but race is not the defining characteristic any longer. And this is very important to me as an ex-German, because racism was deeply, anti-Semitism was deeply, deeply instilled in Germany. It still exists, but in a very different conception in the population, among the elites, of how do you think about the world. So how about Anglo-America in international relations? What's distinctive of Anglo-America is that what we think as a hostile world inhabited by enemies, the other, this Hobbesian thing, right? For Anglo-America actually is a very friendly world. The external self is white. That makes you feel comfortable. There is the Queen there. And the British Navy, okay? Don't underestimate the Navy, okay? But the external environment is not what we teach our students. The system of 1648, we are all Germans or Canadians and we fight in 1812 or 1939 or whatever, okay? In Anglo-America, no. You're there, it's like a warm shower. The other is inside. You have to deal with the other, right? Australia is a wonderful example. There are lots of others in Canada. This is a sore subject. I'm not going to go there, okay? So what then happens historically is the growth of Anglo-America beyond what Churchill called the history of the English-speaking people, okay? through military conquest, Anglo-America hasn't lost a major war in 300 years. Through market penetration, it has defined the rise of modern capitalism over the last 300 years. And through what Hu Jintao rightly calls cultural insinuation. Okay? All of those things together over 300 years have made the world more Anglo-American than Chinese or Islamic or European or anything else. So what about domestic politics? Well, we spent a lot of time when we met in Canada about that. And we came up with 3 patterns of internal pluralism. The continued relevance of race in some countries, South Africa particularly, United States and Mexico. The transformation in New Zealand from an official biculturalism to an emerging triculturalism. Big debates in New Zealand whether this is happening, but the Maori have a different position in politics than the indigenous peoples in Australia and Canada, and now Asian immigrants are joining the game. Okay? And then finally, principal conflicts over multiculturalism, yielding to pragmatic compromises in both Canada and Australia. So here now, I go to the end of the 3rd volume and where my thoughts are. What struck me, and I couldn't resist the temptation of telling my American friends they're just like Islam. Okay, this was just too cute an idea. But it is true that they are 2 bridge civilizations. Islam is, I think, the only global, if you think conventionally in regional, think the only global civilization, from Indonesia to Senegal. And in many places of the world, it's all about hyphenated Islam. I followed the debate in Europe, Euro-Islam. I just reference Afro-Islam, okay? So you study Senegal, that's it. That's what it's about, Afro-Islam, right? So it is a civilization which is particularly adept at insinuating itself and making compromises and changing the context in which it finds itself. Anglo-America doesn't have that kind of spread, but it has a particular connection to the global context in which it operates, what I call the vertical connection to the civilization of modernity. Think of English as the lingua franca. Think of human rights, the human rights revolution of the last 50 years. Think of science and technology. Think of the popular culture industries. But most importantly, think of the enchantment which comes from the concept of the New World, which nobody else has. China's not a new world. And by new world, I mean new with a capital N and world with a capital W. In the 3rd letter which Columbus sends back to the Spanish king, he describes that new world. And he says, it's like a pear with the nipple turned upwards towards heaven. Well, if ever you wanted to have a sexual metaphor addressing the Spanish king, this was it, okay? But it has this quality. And personally, I can tell you, it had that quality for me in the 1950s. Right? Germany was destroyed. There was no fun there. I mean, I took it as normal. I played in the ruins, but I was devouring everything about America. I wanted to see it. America, for me, was blonde girls on a beach in California playing volleyball and eating ice cream. I mean, this was great. Okay, it turned out different, but the fact that the idea was there was enormously important. I think as an idea, I've talked to many people, and when we did the project on anti-Americanism, I talked a lot. It has this quality of spurring the collective and individual imagination, which is very different from being a white brand. China right now is a white brand. A white brand is something which you can imagine. You know? China is a white brand. It's saying, boy, can you build a transportation system like that? How do you build 5,000 skyscrapers in 20 years? Those are all amazing. And this is what people in Nigeria and Africa and Latin America think. But it does not enchant the imagination. This is cultural capital, which this bridge civilization has. So how do we think about cultural and political commensurabilities? And here, this is work I want to do in the future. I want to think hard about civil religious politics, which is the intermingling of secular and religious politics. Religion is vastly underplayed in international relations, and in the United States, I assume in Canada, certainly in Europe. It's vastly important in its many different forms. throughout the world. Just think of Japan, which people say is a highly secular society, as France. It turns out in the 1980s when I looked, 10,000 new religions registered with the state. Some of them pretty freakish, starting, attacks on the Japanese weapons of mass destruction in 1995. Okay. So civil religious politics, it's a way in which I would look for commensurabilities. And the second one, studying the transcendental versus what Murakami Sensei calls the historiological politics. At Cornell, certainly, and I assume it's true here, the culture war is between religion and science. And the professors are all full of themselves. Of course, how can you be religious? This strikes me as a name. Murakami is right. Science and religion aim for the transcendental in different forms. This is not how most of my Japanese or Chinese friends think about the world. They are here in the here and now, in the muck of everyday life. That's what they worry about. How do you get by in the world of honne or tatame? Okay? The real world and the world of appearance. So somehow I think the commensurabilities will come out of the study of those things. So polymorphic globalism, it's going to be thin. It's a veneer. It doesn't have the solidity of the civilizations or the national other actors which are embedded in civilization. I read a book by a French philosopher, Braque, He writes about Rome compared to Athens and Jerusalem. And Rome is empty. It has no cultural values, no content. It's a transmission culture. And that is Rome's brilliance. That is why it lasted as long as it did. The lack of content. And that reminded me very much of writings on Japanese popular culture. A rich field, theoretically very sophisticated, empirically very detailed, where the core insight is that Japanese popular culture industry succeeded in Asia when it became quote-unquote odorless, when it stripped itself of anything Japanese. So now, you go to China and you watch what kids watch on Saturday morning on TV. They're watching Japanese manga. The parents hate it because they are all anti-Japanese bigots. But the programs are so good that they say, can't object to the program. They're good programs. Okay. And finally, we have this strand, of course, in liberal thought. I'm thinking of Ernie Haas's, last big book before he died, the 2 volumes of nationalism. Ernie's basic position is thin proceduralism. Okay? So I think this will be an attribute of what I call polymorphic globalism. But it will be more demanding. Thin does not mean that it's not demanding. It will demand not imposing a single standard of conduct. This is what where liberalism falls down. Liberalism says there's one standard, it's our standard. And the rest of the world says, well, wait a minute. In a world of hyphenated liberalisms, why should your hyphenation be better than my hyphenation? Okay? So no single standard, and yet no relativism of accepting all political practices. Human rights and human well-being as processes which define polymorphic globalism are now accepted and have to be invoked as sources of legitimacy and authority everywhere. Okay? So you can't just say, well, but they are my peasants who I'm killing. That's none of your business. Russia's position right now in Syria, right? That doesn't work any longer. Russia already says, how the hell do we get out of this box? We've got to make deals somehow with Canada and everybody else, But we don't want a repeat of Libya. It's testimony to the power of ideas, 2 ideas, human rights and human well-being, which no political center of authority any longer monopolizes. They have distended themselves from existing actors. So how do you think about this world? Well, it's not the telephone pad with 2 straight lines. So you got to make a choice. You like Baroque or Gothic? I like Baroque. Okay? So it is complex, this way of thinking about it. It's not what in your methods classes in statistics and econometrics you're being taught, getting the equations down to reduced form. Okay? It's not working that way. So this is not a talk which I would ever give to an economics audience. Okay? But for the future, I think this talk is really about contaminated cosmopolitanism. This is a very rich term from Appia. Okay, I think that captures it. Not the recurrent sameness of the ancient verities articulated by Thucydides. History as the same thing over and over again. So Cynthia, skip the next slide, just run through it. So this is what I want to do now. You know, I want to study human rights and human welfare as these processes which so constrain and enable political actors. And I want to add into my cognitive map empire, states, policies, and diasporas, because they are the actors which inhabit this. So that's one way. And then second one, I do want to write on Americanization and American civilization, and just finished a paper on law, and compare it to some other issue areas in order to get a better sense about what's the secret of America's power. Joe Nye calls it rightly in some form soft power, but I think the conceptualization doesn't lead me far enough. So I'm teaching a course on this now to undergrads, having a lot of fun with it, and so that's the second project. And here comes the last slide. So this is to the Estonians in the audience, Maria. It's beyond, okay, East and West. You know the first stanza of Kipling's. Yes. But you don't know the second. I believe in the second, although the cadence and the gender is not correct. Okay, thank you.